Hello and welcome to the very first ever Marc Arrowe Off the Page podcast. And as always, I'm your host, Marc Arrowe. See, this podcast is something special. It's something that I've been thinking about doing for a really long time, and you know what? Here it is. So I'm very, very pleased and happy to present it to you, the listener, and I really hope you enjoy it because it's something that I've been cooking for a long time. And guess what? It's time to eat. So I'm sure you're wondering, who is Marc Arrowe and what is this podcast going to be about? And why should I listen? Well, Marc Arrowe is many things: a storyteller, an author, an adventure seeker. And you know what? I'm Marc Arrowe. You see, Marc Arrowe is something that I came up with to tell stories that I wanted to tell. I wanted to talk about the stories that were important to me as I grew up, the stories that left an impact on me, and I wanted to share that with you, to connect with you, because I'm sure there are a lot of stories that we still listen to now that really resonate with us as we grow older. We're going to cover a lot of different topics on this podcast, from movies to media, different ideas, and my goal is to make it just a nice place to sit down and chat. I hope you enjoy it, and let's get started. So today's first topic that's on my mind is something that you may have thought about, and maybe something you probably haven't. The topic is, how real is too real? Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let me pose a question to you. Why do we watch movies or read books? Why do we spend money on entertainment in general? Why do we lose ourselves in these worlds or talk about movies that we've seen maybe 10, 20, or even 30 years ago? You see, one of my favorite movies is Back to the Future. I wasn't alive when it came out, but I've taken it upon myself to, if anyone around me says they haven't seen Back to the Future, I will sit them down and say, hey, we're about to watch this. Why? You see, I really want to do a deep dive into why that is. I think it goes back to the idea of something that a friend of mine said in a conversation that I had a long time ago. And we were talking about movies we liked, and we were talking about the way that movies have changed and how some of them weren't just that good anymore. And he said something to me. He said that, these movies, they're not good because a good movie is when life imitates art. But when art imitates life, it's not good. And I was like, wow, that's pretty deep, man. And interesting, that phrase has been on my mind for many years after that conversation. But what does that even mean? Art imitates life. Well, I have a good example for you. I want you to go to Netflix, flip it on, and I want you to count how many genres you see in the menu. There's probably too many to count, isn't there? There's horror, adventure, sci-fi, romance. There's so many different genres that I can't even really fully remember what they all are at this moment. But pick a genre, sit down, you finally finish scrolling for after like 30 minutes of trying to find something to watch. You see something interesting and you watch it. And just so happened that it was actually good. Why? Well, because let's say that whatever you chose to watch is something that you yourself experience. You see, that's a way of art imitating life. The good thing about a good movie oftentimes is not necessarily the production or anything. I've seen old movies that, the production or the value or the special effects were awful. Some people may rage bait at this, but Wrath of Khan, there are only a few practical effects in that movie, but I really remember enjoying Star Trek Wrath of Khan. Why? Well, not only because it had actors who were really, really good, but the story was really, really good. And what I mean about my topic on art imitating life is the fact that these stories oftentimes they portray people in a way to where it's realistic. You see, whoever wrote that story probably based it on something that happened to them, or it could be an experience, something that happened in their life. And that's what I mean by art imitating life. Art imitates what you know. And when you know something really well, when you've experienced it, you can tell it in a way that relates to another person who may have experienced the same thing. And in a way, you connect with another person, you learn how to bridge a gap. And in the back of your mind, you remember it. I was a kid. I was talking about Back to the Future. I really enjoyed the movie. But as you get older, you begin to wonder, what would it have been like to have been knowing your family or your parents when they were young? As I get older and you see the different nuances and relationships, you understand that your parents, for example, were different people. Would you be friends with them? And over that course of that movie, you see Marty learn about his mom. You see him learn about his dad, how his dad was bullied, how his mom, who earlier in the movie portrayed that life was perfect, but really she was just a lost teenager too. These are just examples as how life oftentimes can leap off the screen or page or book, whatever you're watching, and hit you right in your heart. But what's the other side? What happens when you lose the depth? What happens when art, or the opposite way, life imitates art? What I mean by that? Well, let's use an example. Let's use Star Wars. On this channel, I'm just going to go ahead and warn you, I am a huge Star Wars fan. It's going to be a lot of deep dives. We're going to go into Star Wars. See, unfortunately, I know way too much about Star Wars. I have encyclopedias, I have novels. I used to read the books when I was a kid. I could probably tell you characters that's not even on the screen. I could probably tell you their backstory, where they came from, what their names are. A lot of useless information as an adult. But my point is life imitating art. You see, in the newer Star Wars movies, they really didn't know how to really tell a story. I'm sorry, I'm just going to be blunt about that. They tried to recreate what worked in the past, and unfortunately, they missed the mark by far. I could tell you an example of what I mean. Let's go to the second movie of the new sequel trilogy, The Last Jedi. Now, I have a lot of different arguments of why I don't like that movie, but I'll get into that another day. I recall a scene in which I believe it was Finn and Rose went on this mission to find a code breaker, and they're sitting down with this person, and he's telling them it wasn't the code breaker they were sent to find. The whole mission was a fluke. It didn't work out, which was some kind of thing that they were trying to make a point about, which didn't make any sense, honestly. But anyway, I remember them talking about where the money was going, and the code breaker, the fake code breaker, told them that the money was going to not only the rebellion or the resistance, whatever they called it, and the First Order. And essentially, they were trying to make the point that war profiteers oftentimes profit on both sides, which kind of was supposed to make the main character reconsider why was the war worth fighting anyway. Now, when I think about original Star Wars, you may wonder, well, didn't they have similar themes in the original Star Wars? And so I'm gonna go off on a little tangent and tell you yes, but going back to the positive on art imitating life, you see, when George Lucas first wrote Star Wars, he actually used a lot of his influences from Vietnam. There was a lot of influences from ancient samurai family, and the story of the empire was essentially Hitler's rise to power. You see, in history, Hitler actually became the dictator without a fight. The people voted him into power. He used the racial prejudices against the people at the time. He used their fears. He used their poverty and said, I'm going to do something better. And if you know your history, Germany before Hitler was actually a democracy. It was very similar, or somewhat similar, to our government now. There was different parties, and this isn't a political channel, but I will just go to say that what's interesting about it is that essentially in Star Wars, it was the Republic. But what happened is Hitler used it, and it became the Nazi Party of Germany. And that's essentially what happened in Star Wars. That's the story that George Lucas was trying to tell with Palpatine and Darth Vader. And that's an awesome way of art imitating life. But going back to the sequel trilogy on how world profiteering and all this other stuff, it didn't fit into the story. It was kind of preachy, and it really didn't make you think because now the plot failed, and then the slow chase, and there were so many problems with that movie that whatever point they were trying to tell you, it was an imitation. And that's what happens when life imitates art. It's an imitation. It's not real. You don't feel any depth behind it. You don't feel any connection to what's going on. I'm going to save a lot of my thoughts on Star Wars. We'll get into it a little bit later, do a really deep dive onto what I really appreciate about Star Wars and why I think it's lost. But I will say that going back to that main topic on how real is too real, at what point do you weigh down the message of what you're trying to portray? At what point are you taking something that is just entertainment? There isn't anything wrong necessarily with trying to put a message in what you're trying to portray. It's your prerogative to do whatever you want to do, especially if you spent the money and especially if you putting it together. But unfortunately, a lot of media these days are just that. They're just content. They're just clicks that they want you to sit down and not really use your mind or anything. And you see, for me, that's something that I love imagination. You see, in the past, I do remember hearing stories of how older directors or older authors would use imagination expertly, almost like a swordsman. I'll tell you a story. In the 1930s or 20s, back in the era of the time of radio, when there was no video or TV, oftentimes people would listen to the radio. And there would be a person who would tell stories on the radio. He would use his voice, his inflection, and there was the reading of a book written by an author named H.G. Wells. It's one of my favorite books. It's War of the Worlds. You may be familiar with the movie that came out several years ago with Tom Cruise. It wasn't bad. It was pretty good. But back in the 30s or 20s, whenever they were reading it over the radio, the legend has it is that the people were so enthralled, so moved by the vivid imagery that the person was reading, that they thought they were actually under attack by the Martians. It caused a realistic panic because people thought that the world was being destroyed. Now, I tell you, that is just amazing to me as the power of imagination. Another example, when they were making Jaws, and I do believe, correct me if I'm wrong, if Steven Spielberg directed Jaws early in his career. And one thing I remember watching one of the documentaries about him talk about the making of the film, one was that he absolutely hated filming on the water. Two, the prop Jaws didn't work worth of anything, and it was one of those things that he never really said he would do again. But sticking in line with the theme about how real is too real and how imagination is kind of faded from our modern entertainment these days, is when Jaws was released, my father told me that people did not go to the beach for like months. They were terrified of the beach. And about a few months ago, my wife and I actually sat down and watched Jaws. I had never seen it. And honestly, I wasn't super impressed. It's an older film. You really don't even see the shark in the movie. So what made it so scary? Imagination. You see, when that music was playing, dun up, dun up, dun up, dun up, dun up, dun up, dun up. You see that music, and then just the way he shot the scenes, it terrified the people because in their mind, they saw a killer white shark killing people. And it scared people so bad that they, in real life, didn't go swimming. I'll leave you with this. I remember someone talking about old school comic books and comic book panels. Now today, there are people who enjoy gore, and there are people who enjoy violence in movies. It's a very common thing these days. And this is not, like I said, not a political channel, so I make no comments about that. But I will say that I do remember this was an art teacher in class telling me about the way they would set up a scene. And I'm going to paint the scene for you. Use your imagination. So this is Batman. We're reading Batman. It's an old Batman comic book. And in this panel, you see the Joker. He has a menacing look on his face. He's up to no good. He's about to do something crazy. We know he's going to do something crazy. So in the panel, he walks in. In the next panel, you see a victim. You see someone who you see his prey. And in the next panel, you see the man's sweat on his head. You see the scared look on his face as the Joker closes in. So now the book is drawing you in into what's happening. The next panel, you see the Joker approach the man. You see ha 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 written off to the side as he laughs menacingly. And then the very next panel, it's a close up of his hand holding a gun. Now, do we need to see in graphic detail what's going to happen next? No, we know exactly what's going to happen next because our minds are powerful. And that to me is another example of why I prefer art imitating life, not the other way around. I hope you really enjoyed this brief discussion on art and movies. There's a lot more different things and a lot more different topics that I have in mind that I'm going to cover. And I really, really appreciate your spending the time with me. I hope you really enjoy it. As we end, my last words are to you to keep imagining, keep dreaming, never give up, and never surrender. I think that's Galaxy Quest, one of my other favorite movies. But this is Marc Arrowe signing off. We really appreciate it. Everyone have a good night, get a good rest, have a good day, and we'll see you again soon.